Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, from wherever you may be coming from. We'll just give folks maybe one more minute to arrive. Right. Oh, excellent to see everybody coming in. Thank you for making the time. All right, we'll just give folks a few more seconds. And again, as is usually the case, as folks I'm sure can see, this webinar is being recorded so that the recording will be available afterwards. But again, for folks who are here in person, it's really, really wonderful to be able to have a conversation in real time. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and start us off. I'm so excited to kind of assume for the final episode of Watch 2.0, this role of moderator, which has been shared by a few of my phenomenal colleagues over the past few months that we've been running the series. I'm going to ask folks until we're definitely going to have Q&A after the webinar. So if folks have questions going forward, they're welcome to drop them in the chat. There'll be folks monitoring and making sure that any kind of immediate questions get answered. But again, as y'all know, we're here to talk about a really crucial topic always, and particularly in the moment that we find ourselves in now. Science in action, women, HIV research, and clinical trials. Let's move on to the next slide and just get started with introducing our phenomenal panelists. Can we have the next slide, please, if that's possible? And just holler if there's any issue with moving the slides. There we go. So now Watch 2.0. I'm curious, actually, show of hands, anyone in the chat is welcome to drop in and say whether you have been at a Watch 2.0 webinar before. I'm curious if there are folks, kind of repeat riders here in the room. This is our treatment advocacy webinar series here at the Well Project. I think our previous slide talks a little bit more about the Well Project for folks who may not be aware of our organization. We're a nonprofit with a mission to change the course of the HIV pandemic through a unique and comprehensive focus on women and girls across the gender spectrum. And I think that everyone here is pretty familiar with our work. I'm the editorial director of the Well Project. My name is Olivia Ford. And for the past 7 months, this is our 7th month, we've been running this webinar series. It's a follow-up to a successful kind of webinar series that we did 9 years ago of the same name. Updated for today, updated for now. They're hour-long sessions, they're capacity building trainings, centering women living with HIV and with reasons for prevention across the gender spectrum again. And part of the reason why I wanted to see if folks have been at any of the watches or even all of them is that those who have completed all 7 sessions and the evaluations that go along with them get a certificate of completion, which we'll be sending out shortly. Thanks, Merck, for the support. Can we get the next slide, please? Yeah, just briefly, this is a slide that we've been making sure to include in all of our events, all of our webinars, really, especially since the kind of onslaught from the current US administration. We just want to make clear that our expansive definition of women and our focus on women across the gender spectrum is not going anywhere. Just to make, just to be really explicit about that, we are proud to be a resource that welcomes and focuses on women across the gender spectrum. That means all women who identify as such. That's how the Well Project, that's the umbrella of women that we create here at the Well Project, as well as people who can benefit from our materials and support networks for whom they're relevant to their lives and their experience. We not only acknowledge but affirm and affirm but celebrate the existence of our community members of trans and non-binary experience. And the language that we use on our website and in our programs and in this event, of course, reflects this affirmation. And our commitment is to grow stronger in this practice and be more inclusive in our language, not less, not obeying um, malignant forces in advance. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, please, Danielle. Were you raising your hand or were you just?
Oh, I'm snapping.
Okay, thank you, thank
Fierce
you.
advocacy in advance and in response to foolishness.
Thank you. That is right. Thank you indeed. And I'm glad you're close to that mute button because in a second I'm going to ask you and Connie to introduce yourselves. But just briefly, this is what we're going to be running through today. Just a lot of kind of research clinical trials 101, a little bit of that history of women living with HIV and research and barriers to participation. We'll talk a little bit about what all is happening with the current administration. That's a whole other probably 3 days of conversation in itself, but we'll do a flyover. We'll make time for Q&A and then we'll close out. Next slide, please. So of course, as I said, this is probably the most you'll hear me talk in the next couple of minutes as the moderator. But I'll be, sort of jumping in periodically. But I really, this session is really in the hands of these two phenomenal folks who are steering the ship today. Can I get Danielle and then Connie to introduce yourselves?
Howdy, folks. I'm such a fangirl of the Well Project and the work. I'm a fangirl of the leaders of this movement, and an admirer of Olivia and Connie and everybody who took time out of their busy days to join us to talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is women's participation in HIV-related research. And I want to sort of caveat that with meaningful, equitable participation in HIV-related research. My name is Danielle Campbell. I am a doctoral candidate at UC San Diego. My dissertation focuses on women's participation in HIV-related research with an emphasis on Black women living with and affected by HIV in the US. I'm also a social and behavioral sciences researcher, community activist, mobilizer, and disruptor of all things nonsensical as it relates to science. Connie?
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Good morning. I am Connie Johnson. I am a woman living with HIV. I was diagnosed in 2002. I also come to this conversation as someone who has participated in research projects throughout the years, two specifically at the University of South Carolina, kind of back in the day. I also come to this conversation as someone who is extremely not only interested, but concerned about the lack of participation for women living with HIV, specifically Black women living with HIV. So I am excited not only to participate, but to also learn and listen as well as many of you are. So let's get going.
Absolutely beyond thrilled to hear from both of you and to be a participant and fly on the wall in this phenomenal conversation with both of you. Speaking of what you just said, Connie, before I pass it right over to you, and I'll be, sort of closing out my video for a bit. For folks who feel comfortable, Connie, thank you so much for naming that part of your participation and the involvement in this conversation is as a person who's participated in studies. If folks feel comfortable, um, based on any experience in clinical trials or other, kind of forms of research, if folks want to put in the chat, if they have any experience participating, please feel free to drop that in. That could be a yes, that could be a hand up. It can be sharing more of your experience, and of course, this is completely voluntary, but please feel free to share that in the chat in response to that little question. And with that, I think we probably need the next slide and the slide after. And I'm gonna pass it over. I think Connie's setting us off.
Connie, if you're speaking, you might be muted.
I was
Everything
definitely
okay?
speaking. Yeah, I was definitely speaking. So we're gonna start with just kind of naming and looking at where we are right now when it comes to clinical trials in women living with HIV in the United States. As of right now in the US, more than 1 in 5 people living with HIV, which is 22%, are women. Almost 75% of US women diagnosed with HIV in 2022 were Black and or Latina. And globally, women make up over half of all people living with HIV. But the problem is, in many HIV studies, less than 1 in 5 people are being studied are women. Can we get the next slide, please? And here's some just more information about what's happening right now when it comes to clinical trials and women. Most information on effectiveness and safety HIV drugs is based on research done in men. Some HIV drugs may act differently in women's bodies. Studies need to be designed to answer questions for women. A few of those questions: Does correct drug what would correct drug doses for women look like? How does gynecological problems affect women living with HIV? What about the side effects? What about those drugs and how they impact women's lifestyles? Um, these are real issues that impact women that don't impact men. And right now we don't have a clear idea of what's happening when it comes to, because a lot of times women living with HIV are not included in these clinical trials. And we both know that there's a difference between men and women and how these drugs may be impacted. And there's only one way to get this information and to find out how we might differ, and is by more women living with HIV participating in clinical trials.
Thanks for setting the stage, Connie. I want to just give folks a bit of background info as we sort of navigate this conversation around women's participation in HIV research, both living with and affected by, just to set the tone to make sure that we all have the same knowledge base. When we're talking about clinical trials, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about a term that is used to describe many different types of research studies known as people, or many different types of research studies on people. Sometimes you hear this term subjects, people who are, or people who are the subjects of research. There's been advocacy from tons of us for many a years to set aside the stigmatizing and otherizing terminology such that we are no longer human subjects, but we are also better considered as partners in research or participants of research. And so there's a resource that was dropped in the chat. Please avail yourself of that resource. Next slide, please. So in carrying forward this conversation about clinical trials, it's important to know there are 5 main types: treatment trials, prevention trials, diagnostic trials, natural history trials, quality of life trials. And what each one focuses on: treatment trials, which most of us may be more familiar with, looks at new drugs, combinations of existing drugs, or different types of therapy to address specific issues related to a health diagnosis. Whereas prevention trials look at better ways to prevent disease with drugs or behavior changes. When we look at diagnostic trials, we think about the best way to find or quantify or qualify a disease that in turn creates changes, physiologic changes within the body. Whereas natural history trials simply look at the course of disease in the human body. And then last but most certainly not least, quality of life trials examine ways or explore ways to improve aspects of life for people living with particular illnesses. Next slide. So there's been a lot of work in recent years focused on clinical trials to find a quote cure for HIV. So HIV cure is often interchanged with different types of terminologies. One that you may hear, HIV cure or HIV remission, those types of studies find ways to control HIV over long periods of time without the use of HIV antiretroviral therapies. And so when we talk about remission, that describes a person who no longer shows signs or symptoms of a disease as it relates to HIV. However, there may be other diagnostic indicators of a person's diagnosis. And so keep your eye on what's coming out around HIV cure research. It's also an area of research within HIV that women are drastically underrepresented amongst. And then another resource in the chat for folks to avail themselves of. Go on to the next slide, please. So here are some basic components of clinical trials, and this information is super important as folks may or may not position themselves to consider what participating in an HIV research study may look like for them. So you have folks who are investigators. These are the scientists, healthcare providers who help support, conceptualize, and manage clinical trials. Participants, volunteers, or quote, study subjects are people who join, people who dedicate themselves, their body, their specimens, their intellectual property to contribute to the advancement of science, whatever that looks like, without a direct consideration of benefit. If you've ever participated in an HIV research study, there's sometimes this caveat that's described to you that says, oh, this research study may not benefit you directly, but it may benefit future generations for whatever the scientific research question is considering for that study. As you roll through your own considerations about why or why not you choose to participate in a clinical research study, it's important to understand that these trials are completely voluntary. You never have to participate in a clinical trial unless you want to. It is a human right, right? You never have to feel compelled to participate, to stay on a study if you know it doesn't align with your own personal values, morals, or decisions. It's just that simple. Every clinical trial has what's called a study protocol, which describes things like the goals of the study, how long that study will last, who's allowed to participate in the study, and that's described through inclusion and exclusion criteria. These are very key things to pay close attention to as you interact with study staff and further explore your decision or not to participate in the study. And it also describes what tests and procedures are required of participants as part of their participation. Next slide. So as you continue through your decision-making process about whether or not you want to participate in the clinical trial, you also have to be aware of a process, an ongoing process and dialogue between yourself and the clinical investigative staff that we affectionately term informed consent. You must sign this informed consent form to participate in research. This is how you demonstrate your understanding of information that is exchanged between you and the researcher. It's important to consider to take that form home with you and talk about it with your healthcare provider, folks in your circle, your trusted circle of decision makers, family members, friends, other colleagues who are well-versed in research. I know there are things that I talk to my quote group chat about that I necessarily wouldn't talk to a family member or a provider about. But the informed consent represents that agreement, and it's agreement that you should not take lightly. If English is not your primary language, or if the study is not being conducted in a language that is native to you, please be sure to ask about translation. Even if it is conducted in English and there are lots of scientific verbiage that isn't within your specific lexicon, take a minute and step back, Google some things, talk to some folks, and get more understanding about what the study is purporting to ask of you and in this effort to, quote, advance the science. It is critically important that we understand what the study is, what it's asking, not only of you, but what it's hoping to advance toward contributing to the science and what you're going to be asked to do. So you want to take care to ask the staff any questions. Take a good girlfriend with you if you need to. The job of that clinical research coordinator, the person on the front line that's orienting you to the study, is to make sure that you understand what you're agreeing to do when you sign that document. It's critically important. The research won't advance without you. So as we talk about more and more participation, more and more about participation in HIV clinical research, it's important to understand what the compensation looks like, right? That return, that reward and benefit. So some studies offer compensation, and that compensation is meant to reimburse you for your travel, if you had to drive, if you had to take a bus, if you had to take a Lyft, Uber, cab, and it could be supportive of your transportation to and from the study site, a remuneration or reimbursement for your time. It can also include things like childcare. I mean, that would be ideal for folks who have children. But as I mentioned in the last slide, always remember that you can choose to leave a study, drop out, quit, whatever you all want to call it, at any time for any reason without the penalty of loss of benefit of any service otherwise offered to you. That's important, critically important to understand. There can be no punitive action against you for your decision to not participate in a study. Next slide. So we've talked a lot about research, and we talked about the different types of research, one of which was treatment research. So I want to be clear that we understand what the different stages of treatment trials look like. This may be a bit didactic. We're not in class. We're simply sharing information so that we're all well informed about our decision to participate in HIV research, regardless of where we sit on the HIV diagnosis spectrum. So phase 1 looks at studies that will tell us, is this drug safe? Usually involves a small number of participants, usually less than 100 to find a safe dose. It's usually short, may consist of a few days to a few weeks of participation. Phase 2 looks at, is that drug effective? It usually involves a larger number of participants, between 1 and 300, to see if the drug works. It usually lasts from anywhere from 6 months to a year. Phase 3, which most of us may be more familiar with, describes, is the drug safe and effective in larger groups of women or people for longer periods of time. It generally lasts longer, for 2 to 3 years. And then phase 4, which are most common, are post-marketing studies, which examine what the long-term implications of using the drug may look like in specific population. Those are usually conducted after the drug has been approved for sale, and you usually get more information about the drug's best use and any long-term side effects, which we all want to know. All right, next slide. And I'll kick it back. Oh, no, that's me. So it's important for folks, and I'm going to synonymize that for the purposes of this discussion, especially women living with HIV, to be involved early in research. And so my research chooses, or really looks to seek to understand Black women's purview, personal thoughts about participating in research. It can be complicated, and it's not a question that has ever been explored as part of research. What are some of those facilitators and barriers? How do social, structural, and syndemic conditions affect Black women's participation in research as told from Black women to Black women? And so, given the disproportionate burden of HIV that Black women bear, it's important to understand what some of those dynamics are. Connie spoke very eloquently about the need for Black women to show up in ways that are meaningful to them. Well, this is one way. So it's important to understand that results are more useful when people affected by what is studied are included in designing the study. That's a far cry different than someone bringing a study that is prepackaged, preconceptualized, pre-designed to communities of women living with HIV and ask for input and partnership. And while that partnership invitation can seem very enticing, that is not the most effective strategy to truly engage women living with HIV in partnership. That looks like co-creation of studies. That looks like co-creation of outcomes. That looks like co-creation of considerations for studies that and research questions that directly affect women living with and affected by HIV. So that was demonstrated through a 2020 study on HIV cure trial participation. And it demonstrated that men and women consider different factors when deciding to participate in a clinical trial. But if the question had not been asked, then how would we know? Next slide. It's been mentioned several times on this webinar, and it bears repeating again that when we discuss the term women, we want to make sure that folks are clear and unassuming that we mean women across the gender spectrum. So all of those folks, as Olivia mentioned, who identify as women are included in our conversation here. So we would be remiss if we didn't center the disproportionate and profound effect of HIV on women of trans experience. Those same folks are marginalized in research and data. Oftentimes, folks are lumped in or misgendered or miscategorized in research studies that center the lived experience of, quote, men who have sex with men. And so we've understood, we've advocated, and we've seen recent strides and improvements that support trans women's meaningful and effective participation in research. So we talked about this miscategorization of trans women as MSM. We talked about trans women as a subset of cisgender MSM. And then, this little asterisk or tiny line under the byline of the study that says, and trans women. And then we've heard about heterosexual cisgender male partners of trans women as MSM, when essentially we should be not focused on how we believe people to be categorized, but how people categorize themselves, and adjusting the research industrial complex to be responsive to the needs of the people we purport to study as part of these research agendas. Next slide. So as a result of this continued miscategorization and misgendered of our trans women sisters, we see inadequate inclusion, including trans women in a study and failing to describe them in results. And all too often we see tiny representation of trans women in slides, and they're often an asterisk that is described in data that is too small to consider or quantify, which in a sense does a disservice to trans women because we fail to include questions that are specific to their lived experience, which is the whole purpose of a responsive and reciprocal relationship that we hope to foster through research participation, not by exclusion. And we see the consequences of these miscategorizations. It erases important identities. It can advance these harmful assumptions about sex, about gender, and about sexual behavior that may or may not impact the research question that's under development. And most importantly, it may negatively affect the allocation of desperately needed funding to serve trans women, or redirecting of those fundings, of that funding and funding mechanisms and supportive services that are justly due to trans women as a result of demonstrated need. And so again, we end up perpetuating cycles of harm when essentially, research can be a tool to support and advance equity through through participation. It just really does the opposite of what we hope to do. And so I'll kick it back to my good Judy Connie to talk to us about what some of these implications are of keeping women out of research.
So, yeah, so somebody might be asking the question like, so what is the problem? What is keeping women out of these studies? And that answer is multi-layered, right? So for many years, our own founder, Dawn Everett, and many other community advocates have called for trials that include more women and people of color. So this is it's a kind of a double, there's a double layer specifically for women as well as Black women, Black and brown women. So people of color, period, and women. Historically, women have been kept out of many types of clinical trials. This is not just an HIV thing when it comes to a lack of women being participants. There's concern that women might become pregnant while on trial has been an issue when it comes to experiments. In 1995, US regulations were changed and women were encouraged to participate in clinical trials, but that progress has been very slow. Like I said, it's multi-layered as to why women have been kept out of these studies. A very large one, specifically within the Black community, has been distrust of medical establishment and clinical researchers. Um, I personally am a person that is from the US South. And in the South, there is a lot of mistrust when it comes to trials, clinical trials, because of the history of clinical trials within the American South within the last 100 years, I'll say. So like I said, past unethical trials, history of mistreatment and exploitation in US research and scientific advancement. We have Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee and Guatemalan STI studies. US government has established strong guidelines to protect participants. Um, However, when you're a person who's being asked to participate, as though even though those guidelines might be in place now, the history and the almost like the folklore of what it is to be in those clinical trials is more powerful than the presenting of these guidelines. Lack of information about studies, including safety. There is that stigma. That's what I'm kind of describing when I'm talking about the folklore of it being kind of passed down to be weary or to be leery about participating in certain trials. And then there's a lack of support as well. So childcare, transportation, and other supports are also barriers to women being included in these studies. And so I think Danielle is going to go and we're going to talk about the GRACE study, which is next.
Yes, ma'am. You said some wonderful things, very poignant things about, the folklore of what's kept women out of studies and what's kept, populations of people of color outside or just outside of the bounds of scientific engagement. And it's this bi-directional relationship, right? One that has perpetuated generations of trauma against the other. And here we are, not 40 and 50 years removed from our social memories about the longstanding impacts of some of these acts. You mentioned Henrietta Lacks. I can't tell you how many other women, how many other people of color mention the misabuses or the abject mistreatment of Black bodies and how it's supported their lack of participation in HIV research. And so there is a ray of hope, right? We have some studies that were designed with our lived experiences in mind, one of which was the GRACE study. It was an HIV clinical trial needed to be designed in a way that could overcome some of the barriers of women and people of color. And you mentioned this policy from 1993 that specifically called for and guided investigators, policymakers, clinical trialists on what needed to be done and why it was critically significant to include in a meaningful way women and people of color in research, particularly the research that examined disorders' social impact on their lived experience. So back to the GRACE study. In order to do this, healthcare providers and community activists, advocates worked with Tibotec, now Janssen, the company that makes the protease inhibitor Prezista or darunavir. The result was, and here's the skinny, GRACE stands for Gender, Race, and Clinical Experience. The study was designed to see if there were differences in drug effectiveness, safety, and side effects between men and women who took Prezista for 48 weeks. And Connie mentioned that, historically, lots of the data that we have that's been used to inform recommendations that guide clinical care for people living with HIV was based on bodies of people who are not disproportionately represented in this epidemic, which we all know, and if you don't, are women. So GRACE began in 2006. It was the largest treatment trial to focus on women living with HIV in the US and the first to focus on women who had experienced taking HIV drugs. GRACE was specifically designed to enroll women and people of color. And here we are almost 20 years later, still trying to quantify and qualify why it's critically important to enroll women and people of color, as if we didn't have enough scientific evidence to demonstrate not only the difference, but the rationale. But I digress. Next slide, please. So GRACE was successful in overcoming the barriers to having women participate, and all too often we hear about women being messy, women being hard to recruit, enroll, and retain. However, in this study, folks were able to reach goals for recruiting participants on schedule. Folks enrolled 67% women and 84% people of color. 67% women and 84% people of color. I never, ever want to hear a researcher say women or people of color are hard to reach in research, because here's a proof that that can in fact happen. It showed that it was possible to recruit large numbers of women and Black and Latina people into clinical research trials. We're not, in fact, hard to find. Sometimes folks just can't find us because maybe they're not looking. So some of the strategies that were utilized as a part of that study to demonstrate this effective recruitment of 67% women and 84% people of color: selecting study sites, clinics, medical centers that were accessible to women and people of color; raising awareness among people that they had hoped to enroll; providing support for participants in study sites, support that was responsive to the needs of people who they hoped to enroll in this clinical research trial. Let's be clear. So I know recently folks have talked about, their innovation in their ability to enroll women and people of color and otherwise communities into clinical research, but this conversation is 20 years in the making, so don't be disillusioned. Next slide. So what's the bottom line? What are we walking away with here, folks? I know Connie and I have been talking at you for quite some time. So it goes without saying, right? This is a women-centered, women-focused conversation. It is important for more women to get involved in HIV clinical trials and for more trials to be designed by, led by, conceptualized by women and people of color. Not just in mind, but led by. That's a key critical component. And I want to sort of raise awareness about a policy statement that was supported by the American Public Health Association. It was a policy statement that myself and the Women's Caucus led. It's policy statement. It's entitled Support for Women's Inclusion in HIV-Related Clinical Research. It was published in 2022, and it's an overarching framework that supports pretty much all of the research that Connie and I have described today about why women need to be centered as part of HIV clinical research. And it seems odd that we have to continue to beat this drum when for decades the conversation and the feedback has been the same. Women need to be centered as part of HIV clinical trials. Women bear a disproportionate burden of HIV globally. Ergo, we should be at the front of the line when you talk about people who are recruited, retained, sustained, and meaningfully engaged in clinical research. There are many women's health issues that are still need to be studied. And then folks can help by getting involved and participating and helping others understand to the best of your ability about their decision to choose or not to participate in HIV research. That is your decision and your decision alone. Next slide.
So the question, we have some answers as to things that can help include women living with HIV to be included in these trials, right? But unfortunately, it seems as though the administration is kind of doing the opposite of what's needed. So let's just talk about it. What has the U.S. administration done? There's been an executive order removing recognition of gender identity, defining sex as immutable binary biological classification, an executive order removing DEI offices and content. We all have seen pretty much in the news within the last 100 and more days of how DEI is impacting not only clinical trials, but almost every facet of the nation. We have there's been a rescinding of the Biden administration's orders related to gender, LGBTQ plus, civil rights, equity, and DEI. An executive order establishing Make America Healthy Again Commission. An executive order implementing the President's Department of Government Efficiency Workforce Optimization Initiative and HHS reorganization. There's been a cancellation of increasing number of NIH grants, which a lot of them actually fund a lot of the research that we've been speaking of. A removal of public health information and data. A removal of the data that does exist has taken place. So not only are we moving forward to get new data, the existing data has been removed. U.S. Global Health Foreign Aid Review, stop work order, dissolution of U.S. aid, including personnel, cancellation of most awards. So it seems as though that there is an effort to not only hinder new studies from being conducted, or maybe even current studies to be completed, but as well as this idea to erase any evidence of any past studies and any past data. So that's what we're facing right now when it comes to this current administration. And honestly, I believe that there is a way for us to, as a community, to those of us who understand the importance and just how critical it is to have this data, somehow, some way, we are going to have to be innovative in the way that we continue to move forward in making sure that women receive the best care and have access to the best treatments available.
Indeed. I think you said some pretty powerful things here, Connie, to talk about how this administration has literally cut the knees of the scientific industrial complex and removed our position as global leaders in scientific thought and action and innovation. And you talk specifically about the erasure of data that we fought long and hard for as a community to give credence, to give value, to give validation to the lived experience of people who we know and love. And so I'd like to go to the next slide and highlight a specific piece of information that this administration worked in advance. And I'm not even going to say just this administration. I get so pissed off my tongue gets tied, but we had worked for, or folks had worked, advocates, activists had worked for a number of years, and I'll shout out Brian Manalga, I'll shout out Russell Campbell, Rona Siskind, Allegra Cermak. These are folks who had worked uh, very intensely with the HIV/AIDS Network Coordination Center. It's the coordinating center of, fingers crossed, the Division of AIDS Funded Research Networks. And it's this rubric that was created. It's called the Representative Studies Rubric. There are lots of publications about it, including one that was recently published. I do hope that folks check it out. So in advance and in response to some of the executive orders, it was decided that the RSR would no longer be required as part of considerations for collecting sex and gender and defining populations to be excluded from clinical research. So this tool evaluates whether clinical trials are designed to enroll representative study populations. We've talked ad nauseum about why people disproportionately affected by an illness should be represented or overrepresented or centered as part of the research being examined. And so in particular, we talk about age, we talk about race, ethnicity, we talk about drug use, we talk about gender, pregnancy potential, we talk about sex assigned at birth. This RSR operationalized legal requirements, ethical and other guidance for researchers to reflect real world diversity in clinical trials. And obeying in advance this measure of reciprocity is no longer required. It's no longer considered as part of meaningful inclusion or processes to meaningfully include diverse populations of people enrolled in clinical research and disproportionately affected by issues like HIV. And so in 2023, the Division of AIDS required studies teams to submit RSR questionnaires. In 2024, after strategic and careful mobilization, all Division of AIDS funded networks were consistently using RSR in development of all new study protocols. And in 2025, no shock to us all, that requirement was halted in advance obeying of executive to follow these foolish executive orders that, as Connie shared, attempt to erase our very lived existence. Next slide. So what can we do? We've talked a lot about the science of clinical research, about what the policy implications of clinical research and how, when we consider this trifecta of policy, research, and advocacy, let's talk about the third leg. What can we do? It's time for us to convene with women's health advocates around the globe to develop an agenda of action, right? It's great that we can come together and convene on these webinars, but it is time to meet and discuss action. What should we be doing to continue the legacy of women's work and research that is being, as Connie described, actively erased? Actively erased. I don't know if you've tried to look online and search for a data statistic related to HIV. It is scant, y'all, scant. If you can find something of meaning, download it, keep it in your pocket, because the data is literally being erased. As we described at the top of this webinar, continue to use language that gives credence to people's existence. This is what we've been fighting for. Publish in journals that support that effort. Publish in media outlets, blogs, blog posts that support those efforts, that minimize the censure of language that just fucking makes sense. Call out institutions that are buckling under the perceived threat of obeying in advance. Call them out, because when we're on the mend, we have to commit to memory these same folks and institutions that turned their backs and buried their heads in the sand in an effort to minimize the impact of, or to minimize the negative impact on their work. And so I'll get off my soapbox and I'll take a moment to check in with you all to see what it is you think we need to do. These are our brief thoughts. This list is by no means comprehensive or exhaustive. We only had an hour to have this conversation with you all, but this is our starting point and our commitment. What do folks think we need to do?
I'll just give a quick amen to that. First of all, thank you both so much for your expertise, for your involvement in this work, for your passion, dedication, and just for that powerful call to action. That's really just again like the tip of the iceberg. Really curious to hear other folks' thoughts and also questions, which brings me to, I just wanted to make sure to we've got a question in the Q&A if we're ready for that, and then we can go into further questions if folks have them. Feel free to drop them in the chat, drop them in the Q&A. And also hearing other folks, what folks have been doing, what we need to do. Would love to hear from you, Connie, as well, as far as that question of what's the way forward, and it's not going to be one way, obviously, of course. I'm going to quickly get to this Q&A question so we can make sure to address it. And everyone be sure to take the evaluation that's popped up in the chat. Doesn't mean you got to go, but because we still got a few more minutes, but feel free to click that link and take that evaluation. We've got an awesome question from my colleague and sister Bridget, also a phenomenal research advocate. Without giving away all your research, can you tell us if women want to be part of research, or what they see by and large as barriers to participation from their perspective as opposed to those of researchers? Does that make sense? I want to answer that live.
I can step in and answer. Or Connie, do you want to go first?
You can go first, but I do have a couple thoughts.
Go for it, girl. Go for it. What are your thoughts?
As far as women, do they want to be, or do we want to be included? And I think the answer is if you're invited. It's almost like there's a party happening over there across town, but you didn't know anything about it. But had you known about it, you might have shown up, right? You might have gotten dressed, put on your best, and shown up for the party. A lot of women, because they're caught up in the day-to-day drudgery almost of like taking care of what women take care of, they don't even, like, clinical trials don't even, a lot of times don't even come up in conversation because it's out of the realm of their lived experiences. So I think that there needs to be more conversation with women living with HIV about what these clinical trials are, how they benefit from those trials, and and so that there's a clear understanding that this is what's happening and this is why it's happening and this is why it's important to you. Because otherwise it goes outside of of anything that we deal with on a daily basis. And I also would almost to go back to the stigma of past trial, clinical trials and that kind of thing, to be able to show new data or to be able to show some sort of new criteria of what's expected from the researchers, to kind of somehow eliminate that stigma will also be helpful when it comes to recruiting women and getting their buy-in. So those are my thoughts for now.
Thank you for that. I think those dovetail very nicely with some of the prelim data that I'll be unveiling as part of my dissertation presentation this August, right, Snell? It's been 5 years. Okay. So I think just in brief, Bridget, I think that was a super awesome question. There's such a stigma associated with Black women in our participation in research, right? It's perceived that Black women don't want to participate in research. It's perceived that we bring to bear lots of historical traumas that show up as a result of what we've literally witnessed happen to our sisters. Connie talked about Henrietta Lacks. We could talk about, you know, random Black woman X, and what her experiences have been with, an otherizing health system within which these very same clinical research studies are conducted. But even despite all of the nonsense that Black women experience as a part of our lived experience, and I use the word nonsense, is all encompassing because it's emotional. But Black women still want to show up to be a part of HIV clinical research, but with some clear caveats. We want to show up and participate in research that is responsive to our lived experience as mothers, as caregivers, as independent women, as women in relationships, as women who just woke the fuck up and said, I want to participate in a research study. Folks have said they want to participate in research that is led by other Black women. Folks have said, by and large, and I'll say it again, we want to participate in research that is led by folks who share our lived experience, folks who get it, who understand that as I wake up with my braids and my earrings affectionately designed by Ooh Pieces, that there are certain experiences that are unique to me simply existing this way, showing up in spaces that aren't always supportive of this lived experience. Folks have said they want to participate in research that is designed with partnership in mind. Folks have said they owe the research industrial complex nothing. That for 40 years, but Black female bodies have been used to advance this work. And it's time for something different. That is what Black women have had to say, in addition to some other things that I'll share later this summer.
Ashe, and thank you so much also for lifting up that work that we'll be eagerly anticipating, um, resulting from your dissertation. And the work goes on indeed, and it's infuriating, it's frustrating, it's powerful, um,
But it's
and sorry, say
it's
again.
it's us. It's
Yep,
all
exactly.
it's us.
Exactly, that part. I want to make sure to get, there's a question about, can you describe paths or ways that women can get involved in clinical trials or clinical trial research design? So that kind of nuts and bolts, like what do people click? Where do people go? Who do they need to talk to get involved in this moment? And also, just as a side note, please folks check out that chat. I think we can also make that available afterwards, because there's some really just powerful points and links also coming up in the chat too. But go ahead on that question.
Connie, did you want to give your thoughts?
No, you can go for it.
Okay. As a participant of research, I thought you would want to take that one. So, there are lots of ways to get involved in research, right? There are community advisory boards, there are community accountability groups, there are Google searches focused on centers and infrastructures that conduct HIV clinical research, and Facebook searches and social media searches. Those searches using keywords are how I got my start in this work. I was attending in research participation. I attended my local Ryan White Planning Council meeting, and at that meeting, there was a clinical research manager who was attending that meeting who had flyers about clinical research studies that were happening at our local AIDS or then AIDS clinical trials group site. So we talked about Division of AIDS funded networks. Google that. There are, well, 3, maybe 2, maybe even less, just given the current climate. But each of those Division of AIDS funded networks have clinical research sites that have community advisory boards. The Martin Delaney Cure Collaboratories have clinical research community accountability groups. And shout out Dejan Dixon Diallo for her reframing of the power of those accountability groups and the role that we play in keeping research focused on our lived experience. But in this information age, there isn't a thing we can't find. The Well Project. The Well Project is a tremendous resource that may be underutilized that folks should continue to tap into. My research or my email address is immediately available. If you have a question about how to get involved, holler at me. I'm happy to direct you to a resource or a person or an entity that can help. But there's an army of us globally that are willing to support. And if I don't know, damn it, I'll find out.
Thank you so much. And also for lifting up the global aspect of this work as well. You know, that it's important to name, especially in this moment, that the US is a significant force in HIV research, but it's not the be all and the end all. If if we need to sort of go to collaborate with our folks at other sites in other countries, it's already happening. It clearly it's being strengthened, in this moment as well. So thank you for lifting up that aspect too. We are all connected. Any final thoughts? Just, to direct folks to that QR code. There are many more resources on the episode page as well. The video will be up there once that's ready. I want to give you all space for final thoughts as we're wrapping up. I know that we're just a hair past time, not too much, but just a little hair. That's how it goes.
Just scotch. Con, you want to take it?
So final thoughts. I am immensely grateful for the research and the data that does exist that has brought us through the last 3-4 decades of this epidemic. And so I understand the importance and the just how important and the significance of this conversation, and for those who are to come, because hopefully there won't be another 3-4 decades that we'll be having this conversation if we can continue to make things happen when it comes to these to this research. So it's vital to the lives of those of us who are living with, and also vital for those who have who are at risk to be exposed. So I am grateful for the conversation and hope to be able to participate more. Maybe not maybe in the clinical trials, but also in sharing experience with other women, in hopes of possibly getting more participation.
Indeed. Other than that, we continue to fight. And in the words of Assata Shakur, we must love each other. We must support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. It's us or else, y'all. So get involved. Reach out. We're happy to help.
Absolutely the perfect note on which to close. Just with those powerful words and that just call to keep moving, keep fighting, keep connecting with one another. And again, thank you so much for this connection today. Thank you so much to these absolutely brilliant speakers, thinkers, advocates, Danielle Campbell, Connie Johnson. Thank you all for your contributions in the chat and just your energy and your work. Be well, be as well as humanly possible in this moment, as I always say. Thank you so much for being here today. And you can access all the resources and videos and the survey. Please take a minute to take that on that QR code on our website. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.